There's not many sources on Anna Adolph. Pretty much all information comes from an article by Lisa Daly, which seems to be the most and apparently only comprehensive look at Adolph's life. Adolph was born in Wayne County, New York, as Anna Elizabeth Eddy in 1841. As the gold rush broke out, Anna's father, Alden Eddy, decided to head west to California in order to make a profit, which he did as a part owner of Nevada Water Company, which provided water for hydraulic mining. It's in 1874 that Anna would travel to California and join her father and her brothers. In 1881, Anna married a German immigrant named Charles Adolph, who was 10 years her junior and had immigrated to New York in the 1850s and had made his way to California by the late 1870s. Arqtiq would be published almost 2 decades later in 1899 by the print company Carruth and Carruth. The work somehow ended up being reviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, and it would be pretty much bashed by its reviewer.
Daly said it's a really mean review, and I have to agree. It's
yeah,
not
it is
very
pretty
nice.
mean. It's pretty mean. Anna responded in a letter, though, and she seemed pretty much unimpressed by the criticism. She seems to take this attitude of any publicity is good publicity with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And she also took out some of her own advertisements for the work, one saying phrases like, "Arqtiq is already a favorite, high morals in Arqtiq, and Arqtiq has come for everybody."
That one sounds really, it is quite threatening sounding.
Yeah, it's very sinister sounding. Besides Arqtiq, Adolph wrote letters to the San Francisco Call and pieces for local papers on women's suffrage and saloon licenses and other, it seems, temperance issues. Anna died at the age of 76 and 6 days, and Charles would live 10 more years before dying at the same age as Anna. Arqtiq starts with the narrator, also named Anna, having built a contraption that acts as part coach, part ship, and part balloon that she and those closest to her use as a vehicle to reach the North Pole. Her companions are her husband, named Charlie, just like Adolph's husband, her father, and a young friend of the family named May, who also apparently was based on a real woman named May Searles. They depart from California and head eastward across the U.S. before heading northward to the pole. There are only 3 places mentioned throughout their trip across America: Cape Horn, which has the most detailed account by Adolph; Chicago, where crowds who have heard of this expedition gather to wish them luck; and New York, which, surprisingly, given that Adolph spent most of her life there, doesn't really have that much detail or an account.
Yeah.
They encounter, as they move north, people who provide them food and clothing and try to discourage them from going further, but even though the morale of their group is fading, they press on out of spite, since the expedition was ridiculed by their friends in California. As the group crosses ice-locked land, they find a number of plants bearing fruit, including apples, which Anna attempts to pick only to find it in the mouth of a serpent. And this Eden and serpent imagery comes up a couple of times in this story. There are a couple of references to Eden that will happen later on.
Yeah, definitely.
On their last legs, with their vessel used up and their compass not working, they reach what they determine to be the North Pole, and they find it desolate. However, they then spot a giant clothed in snowy robes that makes a signal, and the snow falls away to reveal a city underneath. The giant approaches them, and he speaks English to them, and others appear, including a woman who also knows some English. The former is named Showoff, and the latter is his Aunt Robette. Anna and her family find out through them that the city is called Arq, and that Showoff's father, Savant, learned English after encountering humans before when he was lost. And I will say here that Savant's name is not given until much further in the narrative, and it took me a while. It took me an embarrassing amount of time to puzzle out that it was Showoff's father they were referring to. This is something that Adolph does a couple of times, where she gives a character without giving their name, and only gives it later on with no reference to who she's talking about, so it's very confusing.
Yeah, it's just one of the many things that confused me. I don't even. We'll get into it later, but there was. I even doubted the humanity of the characters, like whether they were supposed to be human beings or not.
Yeah.
One thing that Daly said, that it sometimes feels like the sentences are written out of order. And you definitely see that in the structure too, where characters are introduced long before they're given a name or something like that, with any indication of who they are.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also a couple of times where it feels like there was something placed in between a scene. Like, they mention a scene, then something happens, and then she goes back to what she was talking about before.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is also the part of the narrative where I just start kind of giving a laundry list of things that happen, because that's just how the narrative is.
Right.
They are brought to Show-Off's home, where they find furniture that moves by itself, and cat-sized mice that curl up into balls and roll around to entertain them. When they arise the next morning, they don the robes the Arq people wear, and Anna decides to find a church. The building she enters, believing to be a church, is a court, and also acts as a saloon, though Anna is assured by May no one is drunk or disorderly. Anna begins to think of creating a church for all religions, with booths for each religion. Talking to Charlie, they call it a church fair, and say each religious booth will have an animal representing it: an ox for Hinduism, goat for Islam, sheep for Judaism, lamb for Christianity, a roast pig for Chinese religion, cat for Egyptian religion, and a snake for other pagans.
Of course.
Quite the assortment there.
After attending a mask, Anna falls into a fever and has an out-of-body experience, which results in her becoming telepathic, as one does.
Yeah.
She can hear others' thoughts while remaining in what she calls a statue state. After this, there's more odd experiences in Arq, including sea bathing with mermaids, musical performances with no sound, and a city where citizens use makeup to make themselves look old, since that's what's in fashion. Show-Off and Aunt Robette take the humans to Show-Off's Aunt Roban's house. There are 3 sisters, Robette, Roban, and Roba. The latter is Show-Off's mother. Did I confuse Roban and Roba? Absolutely.
Yes, I did too.
The Traveler, Robette's lover who rides on a star, is also there. He wants Show-Off to marry his daughter, but she's in love with Show-Off's cousin, Roban's son. After arriving, the humans see a tropical-like area that Anna refers to as another Eden, and tries to convert some of the Arq people to Christianity, including a woman who Anna herself has decided to call Serpenta, who I'm 95% sure is the Traveler's daughter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Some relation to the Traveler.
Yes, I thought so. Again, her name is given way after the daughter is mentioned, so I wasn't sure for entirely.
Yeah, it's really hard to keep everybody straight. You're doing a really good job of keeping everybody's... It makes a lot more sense to me now, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I've read this twice before doing this, so I think I have quite a knowledge of what's happening.
Yeah.
Show-Off, after some fun with tamed lions and animatronic boa constrictors, announces he has in fact gotten engaged to Serpenta. The Traveler leaves, upsetting Robette, but he casts down a line which Anna answers in the guise of Robette, and arranges for them to marry, sort of playing matchmaker. Soon after, May comes to Anna and reveals she's found a way for them to travel home to America using flying rocks. Now that Anna realizes she can go home, she is anxious to stay in Arq longer, and sets their trip for next spring. She also enters a place called the Holy Hall, where spirits of the dead can appear and be spoken to, and Anna herself sees George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Jefferson Davis, the latter of which she shames, but then they end up having a conversation that feels like it's justifying Davis's actions.
Yeah, like, in a really weird book, this is a really weird part of it. And, like,
Yeah.
It seems like Davis morphs into God himself, and it's like,
Yeah.
what is going on?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the political message Adolph had when she was writing that. But after that, there is a banquet that Anna attends, where the Aurora, which provides Arq with light throughout the year, is mentioned, and it is proposed that someone descend to pay respects to the goddess the Arq people believe is responsible for it. Anna volunteers, to the surprise of all, and Show-Off offers to go with her. After a period of preparation, the two are placed in a crystal globe with breathing tubes, are set on an iceberg, and are forced downward into a pit that descends into the earth through the use of dynamite. Anna discovers that the earth is hollow and sees what she thinks is a moon, but is the fiery core of the earth, causing her to ask herself, "Lamp! Lamp! Is the earth a lamp?" She also realizes earthquakes are caused by columns of fire shooting out of the core hitting the crust of the earth. The iceberg the globe is set on evaporates, and the vapors of it cause them to rise far enough into space that Anna can see mountains and rivers on Mercury. As they fall back to the earth, they land on another surface with squat, wide people residing on it, which leaves Anna unimpressed, as she thinks they are creatures from Earth. She also sees a figure that is both man and woman in one, saying, "These two are one human being." Eventually, she realizes that she and Showoff were on a meteor, and they find the Traveler and Robet on another one, now married. Suddenly, Anna awakes and finds a grown-up May looking down at her. It is revealed that all of the events of the story were a dream, and Anna resolves to write that dream down, which Anna Adolph did, and that is Arqtiq.
Yeah. What a weird one.
Yeah.
So I normally dislike the it was all a dream thing. Like, obviously, it's so old and tired now, like, nobody wants to see it anymore. But I didn't mind it in this case. It sort of clarified everything. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
This is all stuff that Anna's dreaming up.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. Like, it feels like that's what it is. So it's totally, it works that way.
Yeah. I feel like looking at the story through the lens of it being a dream makes it a lot more understandable why there's so much non-continuity in it and all these weird jumps and everything. So
yeah, and that's what dreams are like for most of us. I know that's what mine are like.
Right.
So
that, along with the surrealistic imagery, which this is full of from start to finish. And in a way, this might be the most science fiction-y of all the stories we did for this round because of the odd contraptions that are like used by not only Anna, but the Arctic people. I mean, they have like these mechanized snakes and like lions and stuff, and there's like weird stuff going on with electromagnetism. And her vehicle she constructs, it's like an all-terrain flying thing. She doesn't really go into any significant detail about it, but it's there.
Yeah.
And she made it.
Adolph did say that if that reviewer wanted an explanation, she can give it. I would have been very curious to see what she would have said about
it. Yeah, same.
Yeah, I mean, she really doesn't give a lot of detail of much of that stuff, and so, like, even during the journey, I was very confused about how they were traveling, even though she's pretty clear in, like, the opening paragraph, but then after that, it's like, I couldn't figure out whether they were flying, or whether they were on a train, or whether they were, like, I don't know, and I even had my doubts as to whether they were human beings. Like, it seemed almost like the way she was describing them, they were birds, like the family. I don't know.
There are a lot of bird references, so I do get that. They do reference at one point, they say, like, May came down from her nest, and, like, they are seemingly figures of speech, but you could take them literally.
And in a later time, she talks about, like, I think it's mostly May, but I think even once it's, like, her, Anna, she's, like, perched on somebody's shoulder like a bird. And I'm like, oh, so they are avians of some kind? But they believe in Jesus and they know about Abraham Lincoln? Like, okay.
Yeah, specifically Methodist Episcopal Church, which Anna seems to take quite seriously, and it ties into a lot of the temperance stuff, which does come across quite a bit in the novel.
Yes, yeah. There is specifically that one moment where she thinks that Jesus was misinterpreted and that he says we should drink water instead of wine.
Yeah, not wine. Why would you want to turn precious good water into horrible wine?
Right.
Yeah.
I also didn't cover the way she feels about dancing. She seems very adverse to dancing because she actually has her doubts about the mask at first because she knows she might have to dance.
Yeah, that's another big Protestant, especially English Protestant sticking point, and I don't know if that would have also come over from her German husband, who seems, in the story anyway, less religious and more into, not necessarily atheism, but more of the scientific and rational world. He seems to be perhaps into socialism and other kinds of emerging new economic theories. And he wants to tell all of Ark about them for whatever reason.
He also makes up a couple of lies, but, we can forgive him.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of significant that the writer of the article. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the person that wrote that article we were reading about.
Lisa Daly?
Oh, yes. Nice. So she had been able to find something that Anna wrote on women's suffrage, but she still couldn't really tell whether she approved of it or not. And it's kind of... It seems to me like she must have, because that at one point she even seems to be saying that she doesn't see any reason why a woman can't be president of the Republic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I would say that she does probably approves, but just the way that she phrases everything is just so strange that sometimes it's really hard to tell. And I guess that's just her style in everything that she does.
Yeah, and it seems like even in Arqtiq, because they mentioned the mayor and mayoress, I believe, so it seems like they have, like, a male and female ruler of Arq.
Yeah, and there's that one bit at the end where there's, like, this blinding light, and the light itself appears to be gendered, and that's where they say, like, that the two parts are one or something along those lines. It seems to go along those lines, at least with her construction of God and spirituality.
Yeah.
She said something along the lines of, like, will women equalize in its rule, precedentis as of God? And the response is, that is the universal rule. Again, it's all very strangely delivered, and I think at this point she's having the conversation through Jefferson Davis, which, you know, I don't know what she's trying to say with him. I don't know if he would have been too for women's rights or suffrage or anything like that.
No, but he's been dead, so he's presumably seen like he's touched the
I suppose
divine or something. So he was a wise man who now knows better or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, he knows like the universal truth. So yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the weirdest things that we've done. On
definitely.
I would say it's like right up there with A Voyage to Arcturus, and yet it was more like Senior Knickknack to me. In a way that I had a lot of trouble grasping what was happening and why.
Yeah, I think for the strangest stuff we've covered, Knickknack, Blazing World, and I guess really those two, it's really no comparison directly between the three of them. This one kind of sticks out on its own and how it feels. It's a really personal look, I guess, at Anna's life, because these people are people she knows. It's her family, and she put herself in the narrative.
Yeah.
And the Daly article says that a lot of this reflects her personal traveling, and that she wanted to incorporate that into the narrative. And I think when we dream stuff, like in our minds, a lot of real life events will present itself, but in this kind of jumbled, nonsensical way. And that's kind of how it flows. It's almost like a dream-like, surrealistic personal portrait of her life, which is just kind of fascinating in a way that Blazing World and Knickknack were just kind of different in how they came across.
Yes, I know that in my review, I kind of was poking fun at it and everything, but I do really enjoy how earnest it feels.
Oh, yeah.
It's very endearing to read. It feels very, like, indulgent, and I really enjoy that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if she had, like, it'd be kind of interesting to know if she just thought right away, oh, I'm going to publish this myself and pay for the printings and everything and have this done, or if she actually tried to submit it to an official publisher. I suspect that they probably would have said no, or demanded some serious rewrites.
Yeah, Daly did a real incredible amount of primary research into her life, but a lot of it was things like appearances in newspaper articles and census records and other things like that were published in external sources. I don't know to what extent things survive from Anna's personal life. Like, I don't know if any of her personal papers or correspondence are still in existence.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't sound like it. It sounded like she would have sought them out if they were available anywhere.
Yeah, if she had any letters or diaries.
But I don't know. I see what you mean, though. It is quite endearing, really. I mean, I say that I struggled with it, but I mean, I did get through it pretty quick. It's not long. That helped.
It's not long at all.
But I think that because it's so eccentric, that's kind of fascinating, and it sort of it makes you curious about the person who wrote it. So it was good to read that background because it did help a little bit in sort of gaining an understanding of what kind of person she might possibly have been, and why she decided to do this form of autobiographical dream interpretive, like, sort of weird, fantastical story about heading to the North Pole and finding true knowledge and discovering the universal truth and so forth. And then there's a neat Hollow Earth journey at the end, and that's cool.
Yeah. So maybe I should revisit my Diachkov translation and make the prose even more dreamlike and nonsensical and out of proper order and stuff like that to conform with this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were definitely some reminiscences. Like, I did feel it was a little similar to that, as well as Nick Knock. Yeah, like, it felt a little bit like that. His story was also sort of indulgent, and it was very short, and I would say that I liked this a little more, just because...
Yeah, it's so weird.
Yeah, there's more to it, and there's more... It was just so baffling to me, I mean... And I kind of realized, it's kind of dreamlike, and it is a dream, and so worrying about whether the characters resemble the human form, it's not really the sort of thing that I should be worrying about.
Right.
Right, like, whether everything really makes that kind of sense is like, I mean, I really spent too much time thinking about, is she talking about people or some kind of, like, bird people or something like that? So...
Yeah, I'm sure you could easily get lost on any number of tangents going through random sentences in this book. I mean, the language is just so out there, and it reads like no other author that I've read.
Yeah.
It's quite mesmerizing at times just to read through it.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, she really likes adverbs, and sometimes she just uses, like, an adverb to describe, like, she omits certain words that you expect to see, and you just see an adverb sort of describing how somebody is doing something, or how somebody is talking, or how somebody is looking. And I thought, hey, it might be fun to sort of try one of us read a passage from this book, but, like, it's hard not to stumble over your sentences and then sort of rephrase it and try to figure out, like, where the emphasis goes in the sentence.
So I wrote a couple of sentences down. One of them is, when he is gone, May, in order for ablution, opens nearby a door. That is outwardly a picture. And then in parentheses, more mystery.
Yes. I really like how she does use parentheses really interestingly sometimes. She does use them quite a bit even during dialogue to sort of have those little asides.
Yeah. It's really funny because I catch myself writing sometimes and doing that, and then I realize that's really annoying. I shouldn't use parentheses like that.
Yeah, sometimes it almost feels like there's no rhyme or reason to what gets in the parentheses and what doesn't.
Some of these works, like, it's just hard to say that much about it because I don't fully pretend to understand where she was coming from with a lot of it, and I don't really understand the whole religious thing that she was. I don't know. I mean, I guess it's sort of modernist, you know, the whole idea of the universal church and stuff like that. I think the article mentioned Unitarians at one point.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure she was a Methodist Episcopal church follower, like, in her personal life.
Okay.
It's not really overbearing in the religious sense in that it doesn't have the finger wagging that some of the other more heavily religious-based texts from this time can fall into that trap.
I mean, I was reminded a little bit of Marie Corelli's Electric Christianity.
Yeah, right. It's as equally bizarre.
And there was some talk about that, like about electricity and the nature of electricity and its source. I can't quite remember what she was trying to say, but it definitely it made me feel that whole the Son of God is our electrical cable between us and the divinity kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, is it Serpenta or Robet, maybe, says something like, in a century hence, electricity will create a human being. And it seems to have some divine implications.
Is that didn't she read that in one of the newspaper articles? Like, they have one newspaper that they bring, and I think they mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it made me think of, I mean, obviously, I would be very surprised if she knew anything about it, but, like, I kind of had Future Eve pop into my head.
Oh, yeah, right. And, I mean, certainly this was written a little later than that, so electrification was well underway, and I think even some, like, appliances has started to be electrified, but certainly power and things like that, as well as these weird automatons and, like, other electrical devices, the telegraph and the telephone, were very present in American life in 1899.
Yeah, very interesting work.
Yeah.
I really don't, I don't know that I really have anything else to add about it. I kind of recommend it a little bit, I think. Some people would enjoy it, especially if you like really eccentric, bizarre turn-of-the-century stuff. You might find it pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you like weird prose and outsider stuff especially, this is one to check out. If you're looking for a more straightforward adventure novel, you're not going to find one here.
No. And points to Anna, this is one of the few times where I wasn't like let down by the dream ending. You know?
Right, yeah.
I was
yeah,
like,
it's like, oh, this actually makes it sort of better to know that it's so, that's why it's so surreal.
Yeah. It almost ties it together in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so that's Arqtiq by Anna Adolph. And we will be now turning to author that we discussed on Chrononauts once before. We will be discussing The Moonstone Mass by Harriet Prescott Spofford. I should have supposed myself to be in the region of the magnetic pole of the sphere, if I did not know that I had long since left it behind me. My pocket compass had become entirely useless, and every scrap of metal that I had about me had become a lodestone. The very ice, as if it were congealed from water that held large quantities of iron in solution. Iron escaping from whatever solid land there was beneath or around. The plutonic rock that such a region could have alone veined and seamed with metal. The very ice appeared to have a magnetic quality. It held me so that I changed my position upon it with difficulty, and as if it established a battery by the aid of the singular atmosphere above it, frequently sent thrills quivering through and through me, till my flesh seemed about to resolve into all the jarring atoms of its original constitution, and again soothed me with a velvet touch into a state which, if it were not sleep, was at least haunted by visions that I dare not believe to have been realities, and from which I always awoke with a start to find myself still floating. My watch had long since ceased to beat. I felt an odd persuasion that I had died when that stood still, and only this slavery of the magnet, of the cold, this power that locked everything in invisible fetters and let nothing loose again, held my soul still in the bonds of my body. Another idea also took possession of me, for my mind was open to whatever visitant chose to enter, since utter despair of safety or release had left it vacant of a hope or fear. These enormous days and nights, swinging in their arc 6 months long, were the pendulum that dealt time in another measure than that dealt by the sunlight of lower zones. They told the time of what interminable years, the years of what vast generations far beyond the span that covered the age of the primeval men of Scripture. They measured time on this gigantic and enduring scale for what wonderful and mighty beings, old as the everlasting hills, as destitute as they of mortal sympathy, cold and inscrutable, handling the two-edged javelins of frost and magnetism, and served by all the unknown polar agencies. I fancied that I saw their far-reaching cohorts, marshalling and maneuvering at times, in the field of a horizon that was boundless, the glitter of their spears and casques, the sheen of their white banners, and again, sitting in fearful circle with their phantasmagoria, they shut and hemmed me in, and watched me writhe like a worm before them. Harriet Elizabeth Prescott was born in 1835. We covered her story, The Ray of Displacement, previously on our mammoth-sized short story episode. And that was an extremely gothic, extremely cool piece of writing that I think we liked quite a bit.
Yep.
And there's something about Prescott's style that is a little bit, it makes you want to read it a second time when you're done with it. It's, I guess, a dreamlike quality, but not at all the same as Anna Adolph's. I would definitely say that Harriet is a much more schooled sort of writer. She definitely has quite a reputation, although she's not well read today. She wrote a vast amount of work starting in the 1850s, and she was yet another young writer, although she wasn't quite as young as, for example, Mary Shelley or Jane Webb when they started out. But she also was in a position where she needed to support her family, and she did this by her writing. And she wrote hundreds and hundreds of short stories early on for magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and several other popular literary periodicals of the time. She also wrote several Gothic novels, and she's considered the first woman writer in America to write detective fiction. So, Moonstone Mass is a story that came out in 1868, which, funny coincidence, the same year that Wilkie Collins' story The Moonstone came out. But, I mean, they're not that similar, but it's just kind of a neat little coincidence, I guess. But I don't want to get much into Harriet's background, but there is one incident that I wonder, and we can discuss this, but I wonder if this incident actually had an influence on her writing this story. So she was born in Maine, and she spent most of her time between Maine and Massachusetts. But when she was a young teen, her father moved to California and wanted to take part in the gold rush. And so he actually became quite a prestigious person there, and he helped to found Oregon City in Oregon and was elected mayor there 3 times. But while he was working, I guess, he was involved in some strenuous labor, and he suffered some kind of injury that rendered him paralyzed. And he was essentially unable to work for the rest of his life. And not long after that, Harriet's mother also suffered some kind of malady and was pretty much bedridden. Harriet had several sisters, and she was the oldest. Now, what I wonder about, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the story, about how much this sort of incident might have impacted her thinking along certain lines. Both David G. Hartwell and Jess Nevins, David Hartwell is the editor of the Foundations of Fear anthology, where this story can be found, among other places. And Jess Nevins, as we discussed before, has written and compiled the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Victoriana, which we referred to a few times in this podcast.
Yeah, he's got to be like one of the top 5 most knowledgeable people in the world about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it's both of their opinion that Prescott, she wrote too much and too quickly, and that at times made her quality suffer. But you got to realize, I guess, that like she probably wasn't getting paid that much for stories, and she just had to keep going. So she was very prolific. Many stories, poems, travel articles about interior decorating, you name it. She did it all. And unfortunately, it does seem to be the case that only a few of her stories are well regarded and known today. So this is a pretty short one, and I'm going to keep this quite short because I believe for this story, you really have to experience it. There's really no substitute. No summary is really going to quite do it justice. There's an excerpt that we inserted before this session where we read a section of the story, and it pretty much is what you are in for when you read this story, and you read it for the atmosphere. So right off, we're talking about his ancestors, the ancestors of the narrator, and their tendency to be acquisitive against all odds and reason. And they all have a fear of dying in poverty. And what I just think is really interesting is right from the get-go, the narrator is describing this almost as though it's a family curse. This narrator, who's never named, is the manager of the family estate. But he has no remaining relatives except for a hateful-seeming, misogynistic, rich old uncle. And our man is engaged to be married to someone, and he's fretting about the expenses that he'll incur from the marriage arrangement and possibly children coming into the picture. And he worries that they'll end up in the poorhouse, and his fiancée just sort of laughs at him. She says, well, I'm happy there is a poorhouse for us to go to if that happens. And he doesn't take her very seriously. So his uncle wants to discover the Northwest Passage, and he sends his nephew, along with a crew, on this ship called the Albatross to do it. Yes, the Albatross is ill-named for sure, so right off the bat we kind of get a sense that things might not go well. They winter in ice fields and are refitted and prepared for the journey. And everyone gets to hang out with Glipnu, who presumably is some Inuit person who manages the dogs. And they have a bunch of sledge dogs and stuff. And they go hunting for seals and walruses. Then the Albatross, quote, unfurls her wings for a northward journey. Narrator already seems to have forgotten all about his fiancée and speculates that she might be moldering into the parent Earth, which is really mean. Just wow. Uncle Paul doesn't believe in any expanse of clear water reported by northward explorers, instead seeing the Arctic as an unchanging primordial wasteland of shifting icebergs and cold, which is a big mistake that a lot of people still have when they talk especially about the Arctic. And we are aware when we do this podcast, we haven't really gone too much into the background, and we've been sort of switching from the Antarctic to the Arctic without really commenting on it, as though they're kind of the same thing. They're really not. And the Arctic is much more habitable, and it has a lot more variance of types of land, and there are a lot of people living up there.
Yeah, and from the Americas, from North Russia, from pretty much all the places where the Arctic Circle touches, it's been habited for millennia, really.
Yes, yes. So there's a strange sense pervading as they travel north. When winter comes, and almost within the blink of an eye in terms of the story, like you could almost miss it, they realize they're completely hemmed in by ice and can't proceed in any direction. Endless days followed by endless night, and there are auroras everywhere. And even sound seems deadened and metallic. It's very atmospheric writing, without much specific detail. It's kind of the opposite of somebody like Verne, really.
Yeah.
In fact, at one point she even says, when they start their journey, she says, I will not delay us here by talking about Danish outposts. And it's like, she's almost... I wondered if she's like making a comment on Journey to the Center of the Earth or something. Like,
this one was kind of early, right?
Yeah, Journey was one of Verne's early... I think it was like a year or two before this one.
Okay, yeah.
Definitely 1860s.
Yeah.
So it could have been published by then. I didn't actually look up the publication date, but it seemed like maybe it was a sly reference almost.
Yeah, 1868. So yeah, it would have been published at the time.
Yeah. Interesting. So the narrator takes a sledge with Glipnu and the dogs, looking for land to the west in case the Albatross is forsaken. After several hopeless days, they find a chasm of sorts, and the dogs attempt to leap the gap. They make it, but the ice on the other side doesn't. It gives way, and Sledge, Glipnu, and most of the dogs fall into the endless gulf. And our man's left on his own with two canine companions, neither of whom last very long. I'm not quite sure how they die. There's some kind of lightning, and it says the dogs cowered backwards and were dead. So I don't know if they got struck or if they fell into the chasm. I mean, it's sort of unclear, but...
Yeah, here I assume like a more supernatural, like, even though it's never really described in such terms, it almost feels like an otherworldly presence coming in and taking the dogs
things really start to shift and things become very, very otherworldly. And it doesn't quite seem like the narrator knows what's going on. Like, it seems also, you could explain it away. Perhaps he's dehydrated, perhaps he's like suffering all kinds of mental trauma, and he actually has no idea of reality of things around him. But reality seems, as written, certainly it's getting stranger and stranger. There's all kinds of weird phenomenon, and we haven't really had much indication of exactly where they've ended up. but says he's gone beyond the pole. And, of course, his compass is crazy, and all his metal is magnetized now. And he seems to have a near spiritual feeling of being surrounded by ancient, towering, megalithic beings of great power and fantastic cruelty. And the ice is moving and breaking and groaning all around him. In fact, he's being carried onward on a kind of ice flow, almost like he's got his own sort of vehicle taking him into the unknown that he can't control, and ever grinding onward as if being pulled by great hands. And there's no suspicion of water, and no snow has ever fallen there. Ahead, there's a strange light, and he and his ice conveyance pass into a high-roofed cavern. And he feels it must be some sort of ancient temple. Maybe it is. Everything is oddly colorful. He seems to see crystalline flowers and jewels, and one jewel above all, a great mass that seems to be at the apex of the world, which everything seems pulled towards. It appears to be held by a humanoid figure, but this could also be an illusion. And when he sees this thing, this mass, his hope rekindles. But it's not really hope, it's just the old passion. That's right, the old family curse, the acquisitiveness comes over him. And it's sort of brutal because, he knows he has to save himself. But all he's suddenly interested in is this huge mass of Moonstone, for that's what it appears to be. And he says it is real and nothing deceptive, and if he could just grasp it, all would be well. Now he thinks about his fiancée, Eleanor. Now he thinks he'll return to her with this treasure. He will not be defrauded, and he tries to grab for it, but it seems to recede, or he and his conveyance is receding. He can't go back. The current's too strong. And then everything seems to break around him, and he jumps from ice block to ice block trying to save himself, and he tumbles down a vast precipice, nearly breaking himself on the jagged ice, and loses consciousness. And when he comes to, there are people all around him. Somehow he's been found by whalers from the North Pacific. So he did somehow get that far west, and he doesn't know how. And the whalers say he can't have been undergoing his ordeal very long, because he's still got food. And they don't believe he's found the Northwest Passage. They think he's cracked. In fact, nobody believes it, not even his Uncle Paul, when he does finally return home. Maybe Eleanor does, though. He still has his old knife. It's magnetized to the northern lodestone, and always points north on its own. Which, again, makes me think she must have read Journey to the Center of the Earth, because that's exactly what happens at the end.
Right.
And Eleanor might believe, but she doesn't want to hear him talk about it. He keeps bringing it up, and she says he should be happy with what he has. Does he need another terrible lesson to teach him to stop being this way?
Apparently.
But, yes, he won't. And the story ends on this obsessive paragraph suggesting he's just going to keep trying. He says, "My massive moonstone, my massive moonshine, old Paul calls it. I let him have his say. He cannot have that, nor anything else much longer. But when all is done, I recall Galileo, and I mutter to myself, Per si muove. It was a massive moonstone. With these eyes I saw it. With these hands I touched it. With this heart I longed for it. With this will I mean to have it yet." And that's the end of the story. So I think that he's doomed.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, it was so neat because it's so understated in a way. We don't really get to see the fruit of his obsession, but we know that it's there. I just thought that last paragraph was so effective way to end it. Mm-hmm. It's just, we don't know exactly what's going to happen to him, but we know it's not going to be good. And Eleanor's going to be patiently trying to get him to stop being such an obsessive megalomaniac, and he's just not going to listen, and he's probably going to go on some other foolhardy expedition and get himself killed or paralyzed. And by then, maybe they'll have children.
Yeah, who knows, really?
So, I don't know. I mean, I just couldn't help when I noted that this is what happened to Harriet's own father. I mean, I don't want to force autobiography on anything or anybody, but I just kind of, it seemed like maybe there was a link there, subconsciously maybe,
Could be.
A father who's reasonably well off and not doing too badly, but just wants more money, wants gold, wants a Moonstone mass and sacrifices his loved ones and his future in order to get that.
Yeah, classic tale of greed.
Yes. An obsession.
Yeah, right. This is great, though. I love this one from start to finish. And while I liked Ray of Displacement, I thought this one was a lot stronger.
Yeah, I really like the dreamlike way that she writes, and the gothic splendor is just so powerful. Again, I was reminded of Lovecraft, but in a different way. Like, it's not like the writing is similar to Lovecraft's, but it again is that the feeling of awe and just that whole section where he's alone on the ice.
Yeah.
And like that part that I read out earlier, it's just some of the most atmospheric stuff that I've seen in a long time.
Having read this after Pym, it did feel kind of like the story itself is all the way through how the ending of Pym is, with that very dreamlike strangeness to it.
Right.
Yes, that's true. Pym didn't really get there till the end, and that is definitely the focus of Harriet's story, and she does seem like she was quite influenced by Poe's narrative, I imagine. Hartwell mentions it as a probable influence, as well as Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Yeah, I mean, the albatross is a pretty clear reference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps the slight that she has where it's like, I won't trouble you with all of these logs, is also maybe a reference to some of the information Poe puts into Pym.
Yeah, right. He is a big fan of those information dumps with facts and figures and numbers and things like that.
Yeah, that's true too, yeah. And then she avoids all that. And it's actually very, very tight narrative. Like, I did have to read it twice because I kind of surprisingly easy to miss stuff. Like, at first I wasn't even quite sure why did they leave the ship and go out onto the ice. And then it's just the way she describes them being surrounded by the ice. It's like they didn't have some firm hands like they did on the Pelgrane, I guess, or whatever the ship was in the Verne book. Like, they would never have allowed themselves to get stranded like that. But it just seems like this expedition is a little bit foolhardy, and like everybody gets killed so quickly, and except for him. And yeah, it's just like I don't know. I don't think that she's necessarily saying we should not explore the Arctic, but there does seem to be this real warning against hubris, I guess. And it was also very striking to me how it opened, like right off, with the very first sentence is describing this family curse, almost like it's something supernatural.
Right.
But then you read on, and really all it is they're acquisitive, and they're like worried about being poor, which is something that a lot of people have, right? It's not normally considered some kind of family curse, but the way Spofford and the way the narrator phrase it, it makes it seem like, again, it feels like the beginning of a Lovecraft story or something like that. Only they're talking about something quite normal, really, which is the obsession with gaining wealth.
And she does play on that, like, supernatural implications in a couple ways with the language. I mean, it can be considered a curse, as greed running in the family. Just the title of the story, the Moonstone Mass, refers to a massive moonstone, but it could also be interpreted as like a religious ceremony guided by the moonstone itself that plays out over the course of this ice plane.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before I read the story, that's kind of what I thought
Yeah,
it
me
must
too.
be. Yeah. So it's also because the moonstone has ties with obviously the moon, and that is linked in with lunacy, which is considered a way to describe madness. So, I mean, that's a pretty obvious connection right there as well. I don't know that Moonstone is really all that valuable.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think
I don't know.
I was looking at the composition, and it didn't really seem like I don't think somebody would I don't know if somebody would really die in order to obtain that normally. I mean, it's not like super precious. I don't know, but I guess it can be. And it just seems like it was blown out of all proportion, like, and here he is on the point of death and he sees this thing, and suddenly there he is thinking of his fiancée again, but it's not like, oh, I wish I could return to her. It's like, I wish I could bring this thing back to her and show her that, yes, we'll be good and provided for. And like, oh, it's a real shame. It's not really a character piece, but you can't help but feel like the few glimpses we get of her indirectly, like, it's very indirect, but that she's so patient with him, and like, she's kind of laughing about it and trying to defuse the whole situation, being like, yeah, like, well, at least there is a poorhouse for us to go to, right? Like,
yeah, she's like the one level-head and rational look into this very bizarre and surrealistic story.
So I think we all really like this one.
Yeah,
Yes.
I certainly did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You really get swept up into the atmosphere.
Yeah. I'm definitely interested in reading more of her work besides these two stories now.
A couple of these short stories you can find in various anthologies. You said this was in The Face of Fear. It's probably in some other places.
Foundations of Fear.
Foundations of Fear. It's probably in some other places. I know Ray of Displacement was also in like 2 or 3 anthologies, but I don't know if anybody has put together a good, critical, curated edition of her works, which is a shame because these are really good and I think she really deserves it.
I did find, I don't know how much of a critical edition it is, but it's mentioned by Nevins. It's The Amber Gods and Other Stories, published by Rutgers University. So your alma mater there.
Yeah, right.
And, so The Amber Gods was definitely one of her more famous stories from what I've read. And I did find there's obviously a few things on Gutenberg and stuff. So you can certainly read this and some of her other stories if you want to. And I highly recommend it. I think we all do.
Yeah, definitely.
So
yes. The Moonstone Mass was also in The Dreaming Sex, which is an anthology of science fiction written by women during, I think it's the late 1800s, I can't remember when it starts, to I think 1930s. And I had read this before as well as Arqtiq and the next story, so it is kind of nice to refresh my memory on these.
Cool, yeah. Definitely check those anthologies out because there's a lot of good stuff in all of them, I think.
Yeah. So I'd forgotten that you'd already read this. What was your first impression, like, that this was something you might want to come back to?
Yes, definitely. I had read most of those stories in a very quick succession, so I did get a couple of them quite muddled in my mind. But when I reread this, I remembered it pretty much instantly when I started reading it, because it's definitely quite memorable in the way it's written.
Yeah, and it's cool, too, that this is Foundations of Fear is kind of the sequel anthology to The Dark Descent.
Right.
And a lot of the stories in it are longer, but he did put in a few shorter works as well, and I guess this one was deemed fitting for inclusion, and nice to see it in there among so many great names, and to see Harriet Spofford get a little bit recognized. All right, well, we have one more story to cover, and it is by another old favorite of the Chrononauts podcast.
It is also a tale of obsession. As mentioned before, Doyle is a figure that has made an appearance a number of times on this podcast, so I won't be going too much into his background. I will briefly mention, though, as it relates to this story, his experience with whaling. Doyle, as a medical student, went on a whaling voyage in 1880 as a ship's surgeon aboard the Hope. After his voyage, he was in fact offered to go on a second one as both surgeon and harpooner, but Doyle refused. His experience aboard the Hope inspired a couple of his works, including his essay The Glamour of the Arctic, and an account of his experience, Life on a Greenland Whaler. It also, of course, inspired this work, Captain of the Pole Star, first published in Temple Bar magazine in 1883, and anthologized in Captain of the Pole Star and Other Stories in 1890. Pole Star is told in the form of a log written by a doctor named John Mallister Ray. The log excerpt starts with the ship already in a dire situation. It is close to being ice-locked, food is running low, and the crew is feeling pretty grim. They want to complain to the captain, but Ray decides to for them, since the captain, Nicholas Craigie, would respond better to him than to the others in the crew. Ray sits down with Craigie, who explains the reason why they are in this dangerous situation. He had taken the risk of going after whales he was sure he glimpsed in this region. He also brings up the topic of Ray being engaged. Ray takes out a locket with his fiancée Flora in it, which greatly upsets Craigie, causing him to respond negatively to Ray, something he had not done before with the Doctor. Meanwhile, among the crew, people are starting to get superstitious and claim to be hearing cries and screams from the ice. In fact, the second mate, a man named Manson, claims to have seen a ghost out on the ice, which he follows and finds standing before him. Despite the mate's claims that it wasn't, Ray dismisses this figure as a bear standing up, but most of the crew believe Manson. We get more information on the captain as Ray talks about him with Milne, the chief mate. Mill confirms that Craigie is a pretty mysterious figure with no one really knowing anything about his past, but he is respected, which has led to his rise to the position of captain. He also reveals, though, that he thinks the man courts death. He chose the whaling industry for its dangers, and Milne mentions that he was absent during the year of the last Russian and Turkish war, returning with a scar on his neck. Later that day, Ray opens his log by saying his deliberate opinion is that we are commanded by a madman. He recounts seeing Craigie looking through his spyglass and a look of both horror and joy coming over him before attempting to get the Doctor to look out onto the ice, talking about seeing her. He falls back after a moment, and Ray confesses he didn't see anything, leading Craigie to immediately start arguing against the idea of being mad. The next day, the ice has fully surrounded the ship, leaving the crew stranded there for the time being. When asked to check on their supplies the next day, Ray finds only 20 days of food left. The captain decides then to make a speech to arouse the crew, reminding them of the fortunes their voyages have already brought them in the past, which raises the morale of the crew. The captain seems more cheerful, which confuses Ray after his previously lower spirits. The captain allows him to go into his room where he normally lets no one in, and the Doctor finds there a portrait of a young woman on the wall who displays in her features strong will and a great amount of character. In the evening, he has an interesting conversation with Craigie, who, and here's a bit of Doyle showing, makes a point of defending spiritualism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other members of the crew, including Milne, then claim to have seen the spirit again on the ice, which the captain hears about. He starts acting agitated once again, pacing the deck and muttering to himself, "But a little time, love, but a little time." Ray once again dismisses these stories of the spirit as nonsense, mere superstition. Immediately on the heels of that log, the Doctor starts his next, claiming he might have encountered the spirit's cries, having heard a strange sound that keeps him up the rest of the night. Though the ice is opened, there is an ice floe between the pole star and the opening, so they anchor and wait for it to break up. The Doctor has a conversation with Craigie where the latter starts to talk about what would happen after his death, entrusting Ray to make sure his wishes would be carried out. Ray feels quite apprehensive after this, which is validated with his next log, where he records that the captain has gone. He had witnessed the captain pacing the deck and appearing to be waiting for something. Eventually, he noticed that Craigie saw something on the ice, a white mist in the vague shape of a body. After crying out, the captain jumped ship and ran after this mist, arms outstretched. Several search parties are sent out to find him, even though the crew believes he is dead and searching would be useless. They send out one last party and find Craigie frozen to death. From his body rises a white mist that others say looked like a woman leaning over him and kissing him before running off. After the captain's burial, Ray, disheartened, chooses to stop writing logs for the remainder of their voyage. But not before mentioning that the picture of the woman in Craigie's cabin is gone, cut out of its frame by a knife. There is an extra message that concludes the narrative from Ray's father, who confirms his son's credibility and records his encounter with a man that claimed to know Craigie when he was younger, and that he was engaged to a woman who died under circumstances of peculiar horror. And that concludes it.
What a way to end.
Yes.
Yeah, I like this one a lot.
Yes, definitely. I really like the atmosphere of this one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a straightforward ghost story pretty much, but he writes it so well. And while not a lot happens plot-wise, the imagery he uses, he's really good at portraying that really creepy feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I read this right after Arqtiq, and it was like coming, it was like coming home. Like it was so, everything was just so clear and
Right.
like very well drawn out, and to the point where like there was no, even though the story itself has a certain ambiguity to it, there's no like there's everything is exactly as he tells it, and there's no sitting there questioning what you're reading or trying to figure out what he's talking about. And I know that Conan Doyle always used to pride himself on his writing style being straightforward. He wanted to be straightforward. He wanted to be clear. And from what I've seen of everything that he's written, he accomplished that very well. And it's not to say like it's overly simplistic, not at all. It's just what you see is what you get, and he's not trying to obfuscate anything or make you struggle. He wants to take you and guide you and be very clear about what he's doing. And I appreciate that a lot. I think that's why a lot of even 21st century readers who don't normally, I guess, go towards 19th century works have an easier time with him. And probably why the Sherlock Holmes stories are so well read today, even though Doyle would probably prefer perhaps some of his other works be more recognized.
Yes. Yeah, he doesn't beat around the bush. He gets right to the point with his stories. And that was pretty refreshing after Arqtiq. And it was definitely much easier to write the summary and feel like I wrote something coherent.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. I really liked Captain Craigie. I thought he was great. I remember saying as soon as I think we were first introduced to him, I like this guy. I hope he doesn't meet a bad end.
Oh, well.
Yeah. He kind of does. He has that whole dramatic mariner personality kind of thing going on.
Very harsh and rugged.
Yeah, harsh and rugged, but not cruel, not like, he has moments of, he's like talking to the doctor and he's being very, very calm, and they're having really good conversations about philosophy and spiritualism and stuff like that. And it seems like the men normally would trust him and they would normally like respect him, but it's just he's pushed them too far. It seems like he's feeling guilty about whatever happened in the past. I don't know. And then Conan Doyle doesn't go into it. We don't know how she died. It was something horrible. Yes. We know that. And for some reason, I think it's easy to assume he feels guilty about it, even though I personally, I don't know, I'd like to think that he's not directly responsible, like he didn't kill her or something. But who knows? I mean, I guess that's a possibility.
I got the sense that it was under like similar circumstances where she was lost at sea in like a boating accident or something. And maybe he screwed up and made a mistake and she paid for it or something along those lines.
Yeah. It's very unmelodramatic about it, which I also sort of appreciate. I mean, on one level, a part of me wants to know what happened to her. Like, I would have maybe appreciated a scene where he broke down to the doctor and was like crying and telling about everything that happened. But we don't really need that. I mean, it adds to the mystery angle, not knowing.
Yeah.
And
less is more.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it makes it more haunting because we don't know what was in his past. And I feel like how he went missing for a year fighting in this Turkish war is kind of a relevant thing to add. Like, it seems again like maybe he hoped that going to war would be a sort of atonement and maybe he would get killed, and like perhaps that would be just payment for the wrongs that he felt that he had done. And I don't know, I mean, going out to sea and stuff and like obviously putting himself and unfortunately his crew in a very dangerous situation. He did tell them that they would get out of this. And it was very significant the way he said it. He said, "You will get out of this." He wasn't like, like it was almost like already he knew, but I'm sure he did. He knew that this would be the last voyage that he would be on, but he figured his men would be competent enough to get out of the situation and that they'd be okay. And I think that was still important to him. So this is very early Conan Doyle as well. Don't think he'd been writing for that long when this was published.
Yeah, I think it did. When I looked it up, it was one of his first stories that he wrote.
Yeah, so that would make Captain of the Polestar, taking a look at the collection, and yeah, it's interesting looking set of very early Conan Doyle stories. And that was kind of how he started out. He started out writing a lot of short stories, and although they were respected and they were liked, it wasn't really doing enough for him. So he started concentrating more on longer works and stuff. And obviously Sherlock Holmes really took off, as we all know.
Yeah, right. And this is before all the Sherlock Holmes stuff.
Oh, yeah, well before.
Yes.
I think A Study in Scarlet was from 1888, so still a few years away.
Yeah.
And he did certainly have the experience on the ship as a doctor, which he likes to insert a medical narrator in a lot of his stories.
Yeah.
Not just this and Dr. Watson, I believe the character in The Parasite was also a doctor of some kind.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go into the spiritualism angle as nearly as much as some of the others does, but he does mention it in a somewhat offhand way. But I guess it is probably frustrating for him personally that he's most known for the Sherlock Holmes stuff, who's like this rational guy down to earth, but he can't help sneaking in the spiritualism stuff whenever he can.
Yeah.
Yeah. That said, the doctor in the story was a little bit annoying with his constant, "Oh, you're obviously insane."
Yeah.
I did really enjoy, though, there's that one kind of change of heart where after he's been like, this is mere superstition, this is all nonsense, he suddenly writes this log and he's like, I think I may have seen this ghost.
Yeah,
I think I may have experienced this ghost.
Yeah. Yeah, so perhaps it was he had a change of character after this experience, maybe. He's always kind of like poo-pooing whatever the captain was saying, and like the captain's like asking him very honestly, like as a medical opinion. So what are the initial signs of madness? And he's like, oh, pains in the head, weird noises, hallucinations. There were a little bit of dialogue in the story, not much, but whenever the sailors talked, the Scottish dialect was in full force.
Yeah.
I like trying to read it out loud to see how it would sound.
Like, practice your acting skills.
Yeah. I like it, and it's also authentic because Conan Doyle was Scottish himself, and
right.
he probably spoke like that. Apparently he was made fun of for his accent on a regular basis, like even later in life. And I've heard modern depictions of Conan Doyle as an actual character, and they always try to inject that heavy Scotch burr into the way he talks.
Right.
So it's very, it feels not, it's not put on like, oh, that ridiculous thing we were reading, New Steam Man.
Oh,
with that,
yeah, right. The
horrible Irish guy.
Yeah.
It's authentic, and like if anybody can do it, Conan Doyle can get away with it for sure. This was really good. Highly, just like all the other Conan Doyles, even The Parasite, which was like really over the top, definitely recommended.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in and listening to Chrononauts, episode 22. We will be back next month. Next month, we will be continuing with nautical journeys, since we know that nobody's tired of being tossed and bashed and battered about on the ocean just yet. And so, we were calling this the Mysterious or Weird Sea episode. We will be discussing two works by William Hope Hodgson, The Voice in the Night, and The Derelict. And we will be talking about Harold Visiak's novel Medusa. Now, make sure that your compasses are properly pointed to the north or south, whichever pole you're headed towards. Everybody, make sure that you are watching for signs of pack ice, and don't get trapped in the Arctic wastelands, because we'll be coming back to the ocean next month on Chrononauts.